Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for tuning in to this solo episode titled A Comprehensive Guide to Bulking. This is a note from the future, just to say that now that I've recorded the whole thing, I decided to split it into two because it's about an hour and a half in total. So do not be surprised when you get to the end of part one and it ends in a cliffhanger. You may be wondering why I'm recording this episode, given that I have already recorded several episodes about bulking in the past. In fact, back in the day, at the beginning of the podcast, I recorded episode 13 with Steve Hall, where we covered his coaching method as it pertains to bulking. Then I recorded episode 14, which was a solo episode about mindset with regards to bulking. And I also released several other episodes over the years on topics that feed into the overarching subjects. But I never recorded a solo podcast on my method, bringing together all of the topics that I covered separately, which is why this episode exists. Today, I want to cover the definition of bulking that I use, mindset and expectations, how to prioritize the various components of a successful bulking phase in order to get the best results. Then I'm going to cover said components, namely training, nutrition, and lifestyle. I want to discuss how to interpret scale weight and other progress markers and which progress markers I use specifically. And finally, I'm going to finish off with when to stop bulking. And I decided to call these different sections chapter. So let's get into chapter 1, which is the definition. Throughout this podcast, when referring to bulking, I'm specifically talking about being in a caloric surplus. And I want to make that distinction because I've also recorded some content on building muscle at maintenance calories. But I'm not talking about maintenance here. I'm talking about putting on weight and therefore being in a surplus for the specific purpose of building more muscle. That's it. That's the end of chapter 1, the shortest chapter in this book, in case you're wondering. Chapter 2, realistic expectations and mindset strategies for a successful bulking phase. Just so you know, these are in no particular order. First and foremost, let's acknowledge a very common struggle. That is the psychological struggle with weight gain, which is typical because in Western society, and as far as I know, in many Eastern societies as well, weight gain is considered, in quotation marks, bad, whereas slim bodies and weight loss are considered the societal expectation. For this reason, many of the suggestions I'm going to give you in this chapter are aimed at helping you overcome the discomfort that you may feel at some point throughout a bulking phase with regards to the act of gaining body weight. Suggestion number 1. Remember that a bulking phase isn't the rest of your life. It's a temporary phase that serves as an investment into your future physique. Some people love their bulking physique. Some people start from background where they were underweight or just slimmer than they'd like to be, and they really enjoy how their body changes and how they feel in this new physique as they gain weight. Other people don't. They don't particularly like their bulking physique. Maybe they don't hate it, but it's not their preferred physique. They prefer themselves in a leaner body. However, if you don't make this investment into a bulking phase, your only other option to gain muscle is to eat at maintenance calories, in which case you need to accept a slower rate of muscle gain. So, if your top priority is muscle growth, remember that this is an investment and that you will get back to your preferred physique once you complete this phase and also a subsequent fat loss phase. Following up from that, just to be absolutely clear, a surplus is the fastest way to build muscle, bar none. You can build muscle at maintenance calories, it will be a slower process. You can, in some cases, build muscle in a calorie deficit. That is the slowest of the three potential phases in terms of muscle growth progress, because you are prioritizing losing fat as opposed to building muscle. Another corollary to this first suggestion is that the longer you can commit to a bulking phase for, the better, because unlike fat loss, muscle growth is very slow. You can get really good results in 8 to 12 weeks, assuming you're consistent with your fat loss protocol. But in 8 to 12 weeks, you're unlikely to get significant muscle growth results. So, in my view, unless you're bulking for at a very bare minimum 4 months, you're not really get the most out of a bulking phase. And at this point, I want to address a question that I got from my client Corey. Shout out to Corey, because I put up a story asking for questions about bulking, given that I was going to record this episode. And he asked, how much muscle can you put on through bulking naturally, if quantifiable? This is a really compelling question, and obviously one that we would all love to have a clear answer to, but I'm going to tell you now, I don't have one for you. As far as I know, there is one model that attempts to quantify natural muscle gain, and it was a model created by Lyle McDonald. And while Lyle is incredibly knowledgeable and very evidence-based, it is a model, so we don't know for a fact that it absolutely works. In fact, a quote that I heard from Dr. Eric Helms is that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Now, I only know of this one model, so I don't even know if this one is useful. However, it is the one we have, so it is still an interesting starting point. And Lyle divides people into three categories based on their lifting experience. So he has a beginner category, an intermediate category, and an advanced category. And assuming that these people are in a surplus, the beginner can expect to gain up to 1.5 pounds per month of muscle. An intermediate can expect to gain around a pound per month, and an advanced person can expect to gain about 0.5 pound per month. Now, this is up to, meaning that you could also gain less. And also, these are rates that he proposes for people assigned male at birth who identify as cis men. For people assigned female at birth, identifying as cis women, he suggests that it's about half of that. And again, importantly, this isn't a fixed figure, it is on a spectrum, because we know that there are a lot of factors that go into your ability to gain muscle. Factors that you can control, such as the quality of your training and how effective your training program is, as well as whether you are in a surplus or not, but also factors that you cannot control, like your injuries, your genetics, whether your life is so predictable that you can always get to the gym on the days you want to and skip 0 sessions, or whether you suddenly get a death in the family or a complete overhaul of your lifestyle and you're forced to put your bulking phase on hold. In addition to that, this model obviously does not account for people who identify as gender diverse and who are on hormones for their transition to their chosen gender. And importantly, we need to consider that this kind of person, people like me, they are not natural, because they are on exogenous hormones in quantities that go above and beyond their physiological levels. So if they are AMAB, they are on estrogen, and they don't produce that much estrogen naturally. Vice versa, if they are AFAB, they are on testosterone, and they do not produce that much testosterone naturally. This obviously greatly affects the amount of muscle that they can gain, and the model doesn't account for it. In short, I don't really have a clear answer. I also don't particularly like to think about or try to put a number on this, because now you are placing a lot of focus on the outcome as opposed to the process of building that muscle. But also, you are placing a lot of emphasis on an outcome that you will never be able to measure, and you don't need to measure, because aside from taking your cadaver, your corpse apart, and putting all of your muscle tissue on a scale, there is no exact way to measure your muscle mass. And in addition to that, even if there were, it doesn't matter, because you don't care about having 40 pounds of muscle or 100 pounds of muscle. You care about what you look like in the mirror. So that's what I would encourage you to focus on. I would focus on the process of building muscle, and as far as results go, focus on how you feel in your body and how you like the appearance of your physique. Now, my second suggestion, as it pertains to mindset strategies, is to focus on the pros of being in a bulking phase. Because often, if you feel like you're struggling mentally with this phase, it's likely because you're putting a bit too much emphasis on thinking about the side effect of a bulking phase, which is a little bit of fat gain, and not enough emphasis on everything that actually is quite enjoyable about bulking. For example, training feels the best that it can because you have the greatest calorie budget that you will ever have. In addition to that, you have more food flexibility because of that increased calorie budget. And finally, you are going to look bigger in the mirror, and not always because of the increase in body fat. In some cases, you may be able to tell that you are genuinely getting larger. For instance, one body part that for me grows really well and visibly in a bulking phase is my back. I can tell over a few months of consistent training in a surplus, my back looks wider, which is awesome to me. Now, as far as expectations, the first and important expectation is that some fat gain is inevitable. You can optimize your bulking method using these podcast suggestions, eyebrow wriggle, in order to minimize fat gain, but you cannot completely eliminate it. And if anybody suggests that you can do that, they are lying to you. A second important expectation to have is that unless it's your first bulk, you may not see much of a change in terms of muscle gain in the mirror, but you might be more likely to notice a change in terms of fat accumulation. And this is for a simple reason, which is fat tissue sits on top of muscle tissue. So when you're leaner, you're going to see a lot of lines in your body that suggest the different aspects of a muscle, because there isn't a lot of body fat sitting on top of those lines. Now, when you're gaining weight, and even though you are gaining muscle for sure, assuming you follow the suggestions in this podcast, that muscle is going to be covered by the layer of fat that's getting a little bit thicker over time. And so for that reason, muscle gain may not be all that visible in the mirror, except for some choice body parts where some people just hold fat in a really favorable distribution, so they might be able to notice a muscle group getting bigger without losing a lot of definition. But everybody has body parts where fat distributes itself in a less favorable way, to where now you can't really see much of a difference. And that's something to bear in mind, so that you don't go looking for constant progress in the mirror like you might in a fat loss phase. Because if progress for you is seeing a muscle that looks bigger and also more defined, you're not going to see that definition, which only comes when you are leaner. If progress for you means looking at yourself and seeing a bigger physique, as I was saying, in the case of maybe people who started underweight or slimmer than they'd like to be, then you're likely to be very happy in that situation. Last but not least, in this chapter, I want to address a common fear that a lot of people have, especially when they already went through a successful fat loss phase and they are a little bit apprehensive about doing their first bulk. Often, this kind of person is afraid that they won't be able to lose fat after undergoing a bulking phase. And I am here to reassure you that if you manage to lose fat the first time, you can do it again. The method does not change. Your body is going to change in the process of gaining muscle. But if anything, this change may make the next fat loss phase easier because now, assuming you stopped the first fat loss phase when you were happy with your appearance, when you have more muscle, you're going to look leaner at a higher body weight. So if you gain a little bit more muscle in a bulking phase, let's say that in your first fat loss phase, you were happy with your leanness at around 150 pounds. Now, over 6 to 8 months in a productive bulk, you may be able to be happier, maybe 3 to 6 pounds heavier. I'm throwing numbers out completely at random, so don't take these as actual numbers. Which means that you are going to need less time to reach the heavier body weight than you would if you had to diet all the way back down to 150 pounds. That's it for chapter 2. Let's move into chapter 3. How to prioritize the variables involved in a bulking phase for best results. Training is the top priority, and that's because it is the main trigger for muscle growth, or rather, the sole trigger. Nothing else other than PEDs or performance enhancing drugs are going to generate muscle growth. And I want to stress this because a lot of people discuss nutrition in great depth as if it is the main priority because you are going to go into a surplus. But the surplus is permissive of muscle gain. It's not a trigger in and of itself. So after training, nutrition, in my view, comes second. Although, honestly, after the first priority, I feel like the other components I'm going to mention are all rather important, only for different reasons. In any case, for the purpose of having some sort of priority list to refer to, I would say nutrition comes second. Third comes sleep, because it's during sleep that we undergo processes of cell turnover and growth, which includes muscle growth. During sleep, it's when the majority of our recovery occurs, and thus our muscle growth as well. Finally, stress management is also very important because our body pulls from the same energy reservoir to deal with every stressor, from training, which is a stressor, to anything else that happens from training in the gym to anything else that happens in your life that causes either a physiological or a psychological stress. I am acutely aware of the fact that we all, to an extent, struggle with sleep and excess stress. And I'm going to tell you that there is no need for absolute perfection, but you can do your best to have at least decent sleep quality and decent stress levels. It's when you have chronically terrible sleep and stress that you are definitely compromising the fate of your bulking phase. Now let's start assessing the individual components of this bulking phase. Chapter 4 is, of course, all about training. I have devoted many episodes to training, so here I'm only going to summarize the main components of a successful training program when the main goal is muscle growth. First of all, the training program must be hypertrophy oriented, because each training program must have a very specific goal to be effective. And in this case, the goal needs to be hypertrophy or muscle growth. And for guidelines on how to develop your own hypertrophy oriented program, listen to episode number 8, which I recorded with Dr. Eric Helms. Evidence based programming for hypertrophy, or any other podcast episode on training that and any other podcast episode on training that I've recorded subsequent to that, because I am a coach that specializes in muscle growth and fat loss. So the majority, if not all, of my training related episodes are all about how to maximize these two. Once you have your hypertrophy oriented program, you need to train with the appropriate form to target the specific muscles that you want to grow. This is very different from training to lift as much weight as possible, or from training to help with performance in a different sport or activity. You then need to train close enough to failure. And based on the research that I'm aware of, you need to leave at least, or rather at most, 2 or 3 repetitions in reserve before hitting failure on most lifts. But you also are likely to benefit from strategic sets taken all the way to failure. And when I say strategic, I mean that when you go to failure is going to be based on your individual recovery. Some people can go to failure more often than others and recover fine. And it's going to be based on specific exercise and the rep range. With regards to rep range, research seems to show that above about 15 repetitions, it's best to take a set to complete failure to maximize muscle growth for 2 reasons. Number 1, the more reps you do, the harder it is to gauge your proximity to failure. So it's easier to underestimate, especially when doing a lot of reps, because honestly, they hurt. It burns. And so you may be tempted to think that you're close to failure when actually you're not. You're just undergoing a lot of unpleasant sensations, and you confuse or conflate those with proximity to failure. And the second reason is that it seems like these loads may be a little too light to gain muscle efficiently unless you're hitting failure. Moreover, your program needs to include enough volume for you specifically to build muscle. And volume requirements are very individual, so I can't tell you exactly how many sets you should do for growth. And I mention sets because when I talk about volume for hypertrophy, I'm specifically referring to the number of sets taken close enough to failure that you're performing for a specific muscle over a specific period of time. Typically, I refer to weekly volume. And for a deeper dive into the latest research on volume and the practical applications of this research, check out episode 125, again with Dr. Eric Helms. I record a lot of podcasts on hypertrophy with Dr. Eric Helms because he is a great authority in this space and I have huge respect for him. I consider him one of my mentors because I started getting into the space of hypertrophy by reading his books on the topic. I do want to make a note about volume and frequency. I have just said that volume needs are individual, but I have found that there is a frequency that tends to be a sweet spot for the majority of my clients. Frequency is how many times you go to the gym or how many times you train a specific body part. And in my view, based on the available scientific literature, it's simply a way to distribute your volume across a number of sessions to best recover from this volume and thus make the best gains that you can. And in terms of frequency, the sweet spot I have found in a bulking phase is 4 workouts per week in total. And that is because 4 is enough to include a considerable amount of volume, so it tends to cover people who need less volume and also people who need a little bit more volume. It wouldn't really cover people who need a disproportionate amount of volume. So that's something to consider if you do find yourself needing a lot of weekly sets to grow at the rate that you want. But it tends to cover quite a lot of people relatively well in terms of their volume needs. In addition to that, it works really well with people's lives. And I don't work with athletes who get paid to train. I work with people with a standard job, a 9 to 5 or shift work or a self employed position. And while some of these people, a select few, I would say, are really, really passionate about bodybuilding and they want to train 5 days per week or 6 days per week. And honestly, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of clients who have wanted to do this over the years and could recover from it as well. Everyone else tends to do really, really well with 4 days because they can manage the sessions. And it's also not so much training that now they need a lot of recovery resources that they would then take away from their job and the rest of their life, which is something that they might not be willing to do or enjoy very much. On the other hand, if you're only training once or twice per week at the moment, I wouldn't go into a surplus. I don't believe you can generate enough stimulus to justify that surplus and to ensure that the surplus occurs in a way whereby you're minimizing fat gain and maximizing muscle growth. If you are training 3 days per week, that's a little bit of a difficult case scenario to talk about in general terms, in that for some clients, I might be willing to put them in a surplus. For example, if I got a beginner who has a greater propensity to build muscle than the same person at a more advanced stage, and they could train 3 days per week, and I would coach them, so I would make sure that their training quality was really high, then I would consider placing them in a small surplus as opposed to keeping them at maintenance calories. But with clients who have trained for 10, 15, 20 years, even 5 years, to be honest, who know they need more volume than 3 sessions allow, but they could only train 3 days a week for whatever reason in this season of life, I would not go into a surplus because I don't think that they would be happy with the muscle gain to fat gain ratio that they would get from this approach. In any case, 3 days per week is a little bit of a complicated case scenario, and I would take it on a case by case basis. Having discussed the relationship between volume and frequency, I also want to touch on the interplay between volume and intensity. And by intensity, I mean your intensity of effort or your proximity to failure. Based on this interplay, you want to find the sweet spot where you are taking your sets close enough to failure to elicit the hypertrophic adaptation that you want, while also performing enough volume that, again, you generate that adaptation. If you're doing too much of both, you're unlikely to recover properly. For example, you can get into a position where you're doing a lot of sets, trying to take them all to failure, but this is overshooting your recovery capacity. Vice versa, you can be so fearful of doing too much volume and training too close to failure that now we're not creating the necessary scenario for you to generate a meaningful hypertrophic stimulus. And I can't tell you how many sets to do versus how many of these to take to failure or how many of these to take to only RPE 8. And this is one of the many reasons why coaching is invaluable, because a coach can guide you through this trial and error process to help you maximize your muscle growth potential. Even if you are a coach yourself, which is why I have hired coaches in the past and will continue to do so. And the final but important point I want to make in this chapter is that you need to be able to recover from the program as a whole and at the same time to generate enough stress that you create that adaptation that you're after, which is muscle growth. And while I discuss this when it comes to the interplay between volume and intensity, as a principle, this applies to the program as a whole, because you will not be able to grow from what you cannot recover from. Vice versa, you will also not be able to grow if you don't create enough stress to force an adaptation in the body. And I want to mention this because there are some people who fall on either end of the spectrum where they will kill themselves with volume and intensity and the most fatiguing exercises and training 7 days per week, and that's why they don't see results. Vice versa, there are people who are way too cautious, and that's why they don't see results either. Ultimately, you will know that the program is working for you if you can recover from it and if you can see your performance increase over time. And that can come in many different forms. The most obvious forms of performance progression or progress include increasing reps and load, but there are also less obvious ways. For instance, if your load and reps stay the same, but your RPE, your intensity of effort, your perceived effort for that number of reps at that weight decreases, you're actually getting stronger because the set is getting easier. In addition to that, you may be able to make improvements in your technique or improvements in your mind-muscle connection, and these are also signs that you are making progress over time. That's all for chapter 4. Let's transition into chapter 5, in which I want to talk about the nutrition and lifestyle components of a successful bulk. First of all, let's talk about how to set your surplus. And I want to touch on some research studies that have informed my view over the years as well. First of all, there used to be an old school suggestion that you would want to eat 500 to 1,000 calories above maintenance, essentially a very large surplus in order to maximize muscle growth. My understanding of the currently available literature is that by being in an excessively large surplus, you're not going to accelerate muscle growth, you're only going to gain more body fat. So my understanding is that there seems to be a threshold of maximal muscle growth that you cannot push past with diet alone. Or in different terms, you can't force feed muscle growth beyond a certain point, which makes sense to me because the main trigger for growth is training. So if your training is giving you a certain amount of stimulus, you can likely improve it with enough protein in your diet, but it doesn't seem like you can further improve it with a very large surplus. And the two papers that have mostly informed my view of the research are a paper by Slater and colleagues from 2019, Is an energy surplus required to maximize skeletal muscle hypertrophy associated with resistance training? And a paper by Helms and colleagues from 2023, Effect of Small and Large Energy Surpluses on Strength, Muscle, and Skin Fold Thickness. I discussed the Slater and colleagues paper in episode 13 or 14, I believe, one of the previous episodes on bulking that I recorded. And I discussed the Helms paper from 2023 with Dr. Helms himself in episode 61. How large should your surplus be? So I encourage you to listen back to those episodes because I'm not going to spend too long discussing these two papers. In any case, based on them, my interpretation is that we don't need a very large surplus. We need just enough of a surplus to encourage muscle growth. And I don't typically set a surplus aiming for a specific number of calories above maintenance. I prefer to take a more personalized approach, so I base the size of the surplus on body weight changes, which are different depending on the person, that occur over 2 to 4 weeks. And I typically start with a 100 to 200 calorie increase from maintenance based on a variety of factors, including the sex of the person, how long they have been on cross-sex hormones if they are transitioning to a different gender, their experience in the gym and therefore how much muscle they can expect to gain, their ability to execute high-quality training sessions, which will also increase or decrease the rate of expected muscle gain, how many times per week they can train, as discussed in chapter 4, the quality of their sleep and stress management, and the quality of their overall nutrition, to mention a few. I'm sure there are others, but off the top of my head, these are the main factors I tend to consider. And once I set the original surplus, about 100, 200 calories above maintenance, I then observe the changes in body weight and pictures and other metrics that I'll discuss in the rest of this podcast in a later chapter over time, and I adjust the surplus based on these changes. So as you can tell, this is not an exact science, and I think that you're only going to hold yourself back if you try too hard to find the perfect surplus, because you're unlikely to be able to do that. Not only because we don't have a lot of research on it, but also because what I have seen in practice is that changes to your scale weight, which is the main metric that a lot of people use, including myself, are far less predictable in a bulking phase than in a fat loss phase, or even at maintenance calories, for example. Changes in pictures are too slow to be noticeable every 2 to 4 weeks, and changes in measurements are likely unreliable. And I'm going to cover all of this again in a later chapter, but for now, the point I want to make is that you're not going to be able to set the perfect surplus, and if you're really worried about excess fat gain, err on the side of less rather than more to begin with, and then adjust in the future. With respect to your caloric intake, another factor to consider is when to actually be in a surplus. For example, if you are deloading and you're training only twice per week instead of 4, should you go back to maintenance? Or if you're sick, should you go back to maintenance calories? Now, as far as I know, there isn't research comparing these situations, and for this reason, my approach typically rests on the client's psychology. If you're extremely worried about fat gain and you'd like to avoid it at all costs while still bulking and gaining weight, then I would return to maintenance, because that's going to make you feel a little bit better, a little bit less anxious, and it's going to make you want to stick to the program. On the other hand, if you're not too bothered, I'm not concerned with you spending a couple of extra days in a surplus out of the week that you're deloading or out of the week that you're sick, because maybe you're not sure yet if you're sick, so you don't really go to the gym yet. You're waiting and seeing how your symptoms develop, and then you decide that you are indeed sick, or rather you don't decide, but you figure out you are indeed sick, and so you skip the gym for a week. If the initial 2 to 3 days you're still in a surplus, I don't think that's a big deal. Having said that, I do believe that you want to allocate a surplus when you're generating enough of a stimulus to grow. So if you're off of the gym for the whole week because you're deloading, maybe going on holiday, or because you're sick, then at a certain point after these initial 2 to 3 days, I would return to maintenance and spend the remaining 4 to 5 days at maintenance calories. There is a decent rationale that I've heard for spending the last few days after your final training session, sorry, the other way around, the first couple of days after your last training session in a surplus. And this rationale is the fact that it seems like hypertrophy doesn't occur immediately during a training session or immediately after. It seems to take a little bit longer. We don't exactly know the time course of it, but it may be 24, 48 hours, as shown by the fact that one can be sore for 24 to 48 hours. Again, I am not sure that soreness correlates to hypertrophic adaptations, and that's why I am cautiously terming this a rationale. It's a theory, it's not proven as far as I'm concerned. In any case, if these were true, there would be a case for remaining in a surplus for those extra days, because your body is literally still adapting and building muscle. So in summary, if you prefer to limit fat gain at all costs, then whenever you're not training, you return to maintenance. On the other hand, if you're not bothered, then I would spend the extra 2 to 3 days after your last hard muscle building session before you go on a deload or before you have to deload because you're sick in a surplus. Having said that, I do want to clarify that I'm not opposed to somebody staying in a surplus for the whole week in the case of a deload. For example, let's say you train 4 to 5 days per week, and for you a deload is doing 2 to 3 sessions. Then if you choose to continue being in a surplus for the whole week, yes, you're not delivering the same muscle building stimulus to your body, but we're also talking about 7 days. You're very unlikely to accumulate so much extra body fat that it would actually be concerning. So if you personally prefer to be in a surplus that whole time, that's not an issue. On the other hand, in a week where you're ill, I typically find that people aren't all that hungry, and force feeding could actually place extra stress on your body. So in most cases, I found that people naturally eat less than they normally would, at least when they're in the worst part of the illness. And afterwards, they start eating up back to their typical maintenance. So that's a little bit of a different situation. And again, I would take it on a case-by-case basis. Having said that, I want to make the important distinction that I don't believe you need to return to maintenance on rest days. This is because, as a result of that, across the week, you will actually no longer be targeting a certain surplus calories, but less than that. For example, if your target is 2100 and now on maintenance days you go back to 1900 and you have 3 maintenance days for the week, across the week your caloric intake is going to be between 1900 and 2100, not exactly 2100, and that's going to slow down your rate of weight gain. Having said that, if you want to have higher and lower calorie days while still targeting the same caloric intake across the week, so you account for the fact that on a rest day you have fewer calories by increasing them above this example 2100 on training days, that's fine. However, I'm not a big fan of calorie cycling, especially if you're taking it to an extreme, whereby on rest days you're now consuming even below your maintenance. You're putting yourself in a deficit just so that you can have 3000 calorie days on your training days. Some people take this to an extreme to have an excuse to eat a lot on certain specific days, for example on a weekend because they're going out. If it happens once in a blue moon, that's not a big deal, but you can turn this into essentially a planned binge, which is going to affect your relationship with food long term. And you can also compromise your ability to build muscle, especially if it becomes such an extreme situation whereby now you're in a deficit 5 days out of the week, including training days, and then you're in a mega surplus over the weekend because now you're allocating resources to just these 2 days where you may or may not be training, and on days where you're actually training and it matters, then you are in a deficit. So in my view, if you are going to calorie cycle, I would do it by just a couple hundred calories up or down. And I certainly would not risk your relationship with food for the sake of a 4000 calorie day on a weekend where you're also not going to feel very good at the end of it. So I don't really see the point in having that extreme hedonic experience with food only to feel really bloated afterwards. But it is an extreme I have seen, so I wanted to bring it up and give you my thoughts. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.